From ancient times, human beings seek altered states of consciousness, frequently via the use of psychoactives. People eat, swallow, smoke, snort, and inject drugs to amplify, numb, or distort the senses and change their mood. Many currently illegal drugs, such as cannabis, opium, cocaine, and psychedelics, have been used for thousands of years for both medical and spiritual purposes. So, why are most of these drugs illegal today? Are these decisions based on a scientific assessment of the relative risks of drugs? 49 years ago, in June of 1971, the former American president Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs. But are we really fighting the potential harms drugs might have, or is this just a war on some people that use drugs? Who are these people and why are they being targeted? These are some of the questions our guests will address in their communications, but we hope to move past this and collectively think of solutions that can lead us to a future where drug policies are shaped by science and empathy rather than political and moral prejudice. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening. And a very special thanks to all our guests that are here with us. My name is Elena Valent, and I'm here representing Cosmic Air. Cosmic Air is a non-profit association that was born from the gathering of a group of people who believe that prohibitionist policies affect the rights of people that use drugs, including the right to intentionally change their conscience. In the next few minutes, I will try to historically contextualize the prohibitionist movements and also summarize Cosmic Air's position on this issue. Hopefully, I won't take too much of our guests' time. So until the end of the 19th century, the use of psychoactive substances was relatively free, although some prohibitionist movements had previously existed, for example, in the Middle Ages. However, in the beginning of the 20th century, mainly in the US, the first voices of protest against the relatively free use of these substances began to appear. First, some sectors of American society do not welcome the flow of immigrants and the growth of large cities. Different substances come to be associated with different groups of migrants. We have opium with the Chinese, cocaine with the Black community, cannabis with Mexicans, and alcohol with Irish and Jews. All of these groups are considered morally and economically inferior. Also, medical doctors, chemists, and pharmacists who were interested in gaining the monopoly on the use of these substances were also supportive of these prohibitionist movements. In 1909, following the pressure from the United States prohibitionist movements, a first international conference was held in Shanghai on this subject, and this can be considered one of the first landmarks of the war on drugs. Portugal was already one of the 13 countries which participated in this conference. Later, in 1914, the Hague Convention was signed, proposing that all nations should control the preparation and distribution of opium, morphine, and cocaine. In the following years, the prohibitionist movements grew in number and strength, and in parallel, the smuggling of these substances expanded. It was the birth of what we actually call today the informal drug market. Also, the type of people that use drugs began to change. We started seeing younger people that belonged to less advantaged communities, but who also had greater access to these informal markets using drugs. In the 60s, the first critical voices of this American Puritanism began to appear, and by the early 70s, the discussion between prohibitionists and the most liberal sectors of society was quite heated. It is also around this time that many of the student movements appear, as well as the hippie movement, all questioning the capitalistic and militarized society. In the United States, for example, these groups will strongly oppose the war in Vietnam and will also support the women and the civil rights movement. It was also during the 70s that here in Portugal, still living under a dictatorship that was already weakened by colonial wars and some left-wing movements, that the first anti-drug campaign was launched under the motto, Droga, Loucura, Morte, meaning drug, madness, and death. The appearance of a series of counterculture movements that actually question the current values and the status quo is perceived as dangerous by most governments. And since these movements were often associated with drug use, a new and tougher phase of prohibitionist begins by this time. However, we know that the legal and social penalties for using drugs don't affect everyone the same way. In different geographical contexts, people from more disadvantaged backgrounds in terms of class, ethnicity, nationality, and gender are those who are most exposed to the damages that often result from drug use in a prohibitionist context. These people die from overdoses, they are jailed, they suffer from violence, too often institutional violence and social exclusion. In addition, we also see that the moral judgment and the social perception of drug use is also highly dependent on the social and economical status of those who use them. While the use of certain drugs seem to reinforce the status of higher social classes, the same behaviors are seen as deviant and degrading if those using them are people with less social privilege. So in addition to integrating minority or economically disadvantaged groups, these populations have to coexist with the intersection of various stigmas that have serious impacts on their health, on their safety, and which deprive them in terms of social and human rights and strip them of their dignity as citizens. So for this reason, when we are discussing issues that are related to drug regulation, it is really important that we think beyond our circumstances and our privilege, and we look comprehensively at what the numbers are clearly showing us. So if we look at the more recent data from the Portuguese survey on addictive behaviors in prison environments, we see that in 2014, 26% of the people in prison were detained for drug trafficking and 11% for drug trafficking for consumption purposes. In the case of the female prisoners, the number of those convicted of trafficking rises to 41%. And although the crime of trafficking is transversal to different age groups, it becomes more significant in younger people. When we look at the data of the Portuguese prison population as a whole, they also really collaborate what we're saying so far. The overwhelming majority of people detained only have basic education, and 27% were unemployed before being detained. Still, 50% of the prison population in Portugal is foreign, mostly from African countries that have Portuguese as their official language. There is an overrepresentation of foreigners of certain nationalities in our prison system. And we can see that people jailed for crimes related to drugs are young, unemployed, with low education levels, and often migrants and people of color. And this is the reality in our country, where drug use is decriminalized within certain amounts since 2001. So when we look at realities like the United States or Brazil, the number of people of color and poor people in jail for drug-related issues rises considerably. So it is impossible these days not to hear the echo of Derek Chauvin's voice while he murdered George Floyd, sarcastically saying, "Don't do drugs, kids." So when we look at Floyd's death and countless others before him, the perceived drug possession and drug use served as a justification by the law enforcement to dehumanize and ultimately kill people of color. The drug involvement, whether it's real or perceived, has provided an excuse for these violent interactions with law enforcement. But the truth is also that many people who live in a situation of greater economic deprivation, the sale of illicit psychoactive substances presents itself as a viable economic strategy when you lack a decent job opportunity or a dignified wage. These informal networks are often one of the few survival strategies that some people have. And even though this choice will force them to cohabit with insecurity, with risk and violence of various kinds. So while drug use, it is transversal to our society, the drug production, the sale, and the distribution is done almost entirely by people in poverty situations. For these reasons, when we talk about drug policies and drug interventions, it is fundamental that we stop whitening our discourses and stop reproducing narratives that unilaterally are always pointing the finger to the usual suspects, people with less resources. We have the duty to remember that before being a problem of order or public health, drug use is a human rights issue that intersects serious inequalities that the prohibitionist policies have only aggravated. For this reason, Cosmic Care hopes that this debate can help advocate for the implementation of drug policies that are focused on people's well-being, health, and rights. Before passing to my guests, I would just like to have a word to say this. It is almost virtually impossible to debate drug policy without speaking of racism. And it sounds quite hypocritical, I think, to have an all-white panel to discuss this issue. So I would like to say that Cosmic Care has actually addressed 2 invitations to people of color to be present. Unfortunately, they were not able to attend. And this in no way excuses, but I would just like to say that we will definitely come back to this issue, and hopefully we'll be able to count them and other people as our guests. So once again, I would just like to thank our guests for being with us, remind them that each of them will have 15 minutes to speak, and that at the end we'll have the opportunity to debate together. And anyone who is watching us can pose their questions in the comment section of the Cosmic Air's YouTube channel. So please feel free to interact with us, send your questions, your comments, your suggestions, and we'll try to make them reach our guests. So with further ado, I will introduce our first guest speaker. So we have with us Khalid Tinasti. He's the Executive Secretary of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. He also serves as a visiting fellow at the Global Studies Institute at the University of Geneva. Before joining the Global Commission Secretariat as a policy analyst in 2014, he worked as an independent consultant for UNAIDS, WHO, the Graduate Institute, and others. Prior to that, Khalid worked as a press and communications office in the Office of the Ministry of Urban Cohesion in France and as an administrative officer in Gabon. Khalid holds a PhD in political science from the Institut Catholique de Paris, and he conducted his postdoctoral research at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Switzerland. He is currently the vice chair of the program advisory panel of the Robert Carr Foundation Fund and an honorary research associate at the Swansea University, and pledged to be an international gender champion to support gender equality in drug policy. He's also the author of scientific papers and policy research reports with focus on public policies, democracy, and the roles of elections, and international drug control mechanism. Khalid, thank you for taking the time to be here with us, and I pass the word to you.
Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you. It is my pleasure to be with you today, and to you and for Cosmic Air for this invitation, and to all the colleagues in Portugal. I want to say boa tarde. And I wanted to start by saying, just to respond to the panel of all white people, that I am a Berber from the southern mountains in Morocco, and I am from the minorities in France, my other country. So if that would help, I know what racism is about. I would just like to start by sharing with you that I have the honor and the pleasure today to be speaking on behalf of the position of the members of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. And everyone is welcome to go to our website, globalcommissionondrugs.org, where you can see the positions and the recommendations of the Global Commission. I also would like to thank you for holding this discussion, which is extremely important, especially now in this global pandemic that we're living through all together. The fact that today we see that the COVID pandemic showed really the systemic vulnerabilities that are imposed on criminalized people, that are imposed on people that do not have a political voice and can request services and rights, and how such a current pandemic shows how those vulnerabilities exist really, and how they can take lives. It's also about a time where we see also the legalization and regulation of the medical cannabis industry around the world moving very quickly. So this is very timely as a discussion, and that's why we're very happy to be here with specialists on drug policy and on the regulation of cannabis and other substances. So it is also important for us here because to be here in this discussion, because we believe really that future policies need to be built differently from the former ones. They need inclusive ecosystems. They need to have different stakeholders that exchange, find solutions for the many issues. And so we really hope that discussion is being watched by a variety of concerned stakeholders, and really would help to break this taboo of the inefficiency related to the prohibition of drugs. Um, Thank you, of course, for everyone to being here and listening to us in this beautiful Friday evening and the spring evening after the lockdown. So just to, I think that your presentation, Elena, allows us to go directly into the discussion on regulation. You have spoken about the history and no need to go back into that. So it is also, important to know that what we're talking about here is maybe the policy area that is the most cross-cutting all over other policies, and it affects especially public health, human rights, as you've said, sustainable development, socioeconomic development, security, citizen safety, social justice, criminal justice. And for the last 50 years, as you've said, drug control policies have been based on the general principles of eliminating the production, the trade, and the use of any psychoactive substances from the world. And I mean, we are very immune here in Europe, and luckily from some sorts of interventions that go all the way to militarization, um, to have as a response to drug production and drug trafficking and drug use. So this is why we believe that the discussion today must set the tone and really to remember the framework in which we function. And for example, let's think just of cannabis, because that is the substance most used and that where the discussion on legalization stands today. And that's why we will be speaking about it a lot. Although the Global Commission, for example, our Global Commission calls for the strict regulation of all the substances with models adapted to their dangerousness, which I'll come back to. But our framework that we need to remember is the one that when the single convention on narcotic drugs was adopted in 1961 and its entry in force was in 64, the international community agreed that the recreational use of cannabis will disappear from the world in 25 years. So basically, in 1989, no one should have been using cannabis um, for recreational purposes, which means that my generation, for example, should not know what cannabis is for recreational purposes and non-medical purposes. So this is the aim, and this aim has not changed. This is still what we live within as normative framework, and this is the main aim of the international drug control system. It remains today. I mean, this is completely unrealistic, but it is the reality we live in. So, I mean, these policies have resulted in what the UN itself calls the unintended consequences, including the most profitable illegal market that exists. And if you take just again cannabis, 70% of the people who use drugs report the use of cannabis as their drug of preference. This that can make you think of the profits and can make you also remember that drugs is also about demand. It's a market of demand, and the demand is important and is even daily for people that suffer from dependence and do not get the services, etc. I mean, there's of course the over incarceration that we see today, the issue that it is through the discussion that we're having on the COVID. And I mean, of course, the impact on youth and their arrests and the impact of a criminal record on people's lives. So, I mean, thankfully, that's less the case in Portugal for people who use drugs thanks to the policies. And we're very happy, of course, and very honored to have President Sampaio, former President Jorge Sampaio, as a member of the Global Commission, who brings so much knowledge to our commissioners and to our commission. So, um, I mean, these negative consequences are not the consequences of cannabis use. They are the consequences of the cannabis control policies. They do more harm. I mean, so punitive, it is, in fact, punitive cannabis policies, they don't even impact all the parts of society in the same way. It is the poorest communities, the most vulnerable who are apprehended and punished. And when that happens in itself, this constitutes a breach of the rule of law and of equity and of the very fabric of our societies. And there's that trust that is lost between the authorities and the people, and the consequences we see them daily in the cities and the neighborhoods. So now, nevertheless, we have this opportunity to change and do better. And this is drug policy reform has been one of the discussions that have evolved the most in the last decades when compared with other social justice issues that are also as important, of course, because they all concern people's well-beings and human rights, as you've said, Helena. So now we see that this opportunity is based how all this change has come. It also came from the call of people on the ground. It came from the calls of people who use drugs, from researchers, from policymakers, from patients in Portugal and in all over Europe and different places, and that have called for their rights, for their access to medical cannabis. And this is growing exponentially in different countries. And so nevertheless, at the Global Commission, the commissioners believe that with every policy change, there is a need to pay attention to the details and to always remember that the criminalization of cannabis has had enormous social costs on societies, and that the way any regulated market will be drawn will influence not only the trade in the world, but it will also really influence the way the models of cannabis regulation can move around and be replicated around the world. we speak here about the risks of over-commercialization and others that would not take into account the enormous costs of cannabis control policies, the current ones that are based on prohibition. Just to go back very quickly to what you have been speaking about, Elena, and on the scientific basis, the Global Commission has launched in 2019 a report on the classification of psychoactive substances, which has provided, for instance, the first political reading of a technical system that deprived many people in many countries of their traditional substances, as you've said. And so the system was put in place right after the Second World War, when Europe was in reconstruction, when many countries were achieving their independence, and the United States was hegemonic in the discussion, as you have described as well. So those substances that were culturally, commercially important in Western societies, such as alcohol and tobacco, were left out of the scheduling system for psychoactive substances. But what is even more problematic there is that this system is based on the addictiveness of these substances. And alcohol and tobacco, with the evidence that we have today, are not part of that system. So now we also function within a system that is, and this is extremely unique in the international normative framework. We work with in a normative with norms, international law norms that are not based on evidence and on science and that are outdated. And we have a very hard time because of a political discussion to have a more scientific discussion and more scientific evidence coming into this discussion. It's even hard to have, because the whole system is based on scientific literature, on what is already existing as proofs to be rediscussing the rescheduling. And so because of the current system, scientists cannot even get access to the substances to analyze them. This is a huge problem because we don't know what these substances can bring us as benefits and what they can, and what harms they really carry. And we stay within the all sorts of discussion that are based on anecdotes and not on solid data. And of course, with the COVID again, now we know how important the discussion of science is, and having policies based on science are, and that really costs lives. So the members of the Global Commissions were really among the first in the Global Voices to say that there is an issue, I mean, at the international community level, to come at that strongly at the end of the last decade, and saying that there's an issue with drugs, but the issue is not production, use, or trafficking I mean, they are problematic at the level they are now, because now they have reached very high levels. But the issue is what allows that production to become more intensive for more potent drugs, what makes consumers use in deplorable conditions, making them subject to public prosecution and social stigma, and what allows for trafficking to grow beyond the limits of any control. And all of this is basically because of prohibition. And so the Global Commission calls, since it was actually created in 2011 by all these people that are the former heads of states and other high-level senior officials, the commission was calling for an incremental and a decisive paradigm shift. So drugs, like many dangerous products and behaviors that human beings adopt and use, need state to take their control of their markets and regulate the access in order not only to minimize the harms, but also to maximize the benefits. So the Global Commission also speaks about taking control and not retaking control, because prohibition has never allowed for any sort of official authority to control the market of drugs. So it was always going through between the hands of organized crime. And we have societies today, especially in the European Union, we have regulations on, I mean, we regulate how we drive cars, we regulate how we use isotopes in medical field. We authorize the use of chemicals in the food and in the clothing. And I mean, there is at some point the evidence that there is a capacity of regulating the markets of illegal drugs according to their own dangerousness. So, of course, as I said, the members of the Global Commission call for legalization, followed by strict regulation to protect people by responsible authorities to put in place restrictive access, but in regulated frameworks for people to access the substances in a safe way and in a responsible way, not obviously exposing people to the dangers of the illegal market, but not exposing them to the danger of over commercialization and where potency and dependence can be pushed both ways. So now the Global Commission also believes that an incremental regulation policy that addresses three elements is pivotal. So basically, regulation must be, as I said, again, about limiting and restricting the access, but it needs to be realistic, of course, to undermine the illegal market, because it could not be too restrictive and not allow for any discussions. Now, regulation must also be about social justice and funding better outcomes for everyone. That means that people that are also now working on non-violent levels in the illegal market cannot be left outside of this market and need to become part of it and need to be part of that, of the current discussion that we have about the regulation of drugs. And the third and also important element that we have is that regulation must be, and this is very important, evaluated by multidisciplinary science and be flexible enough to be able to adapt to any parameters according to the results of this continuous assessment. When Switzerland put in place heroin-assisted treatment as a policy, there was a regular assessment and regular evaluation, scientific evaluation, to adapt the parameters of the regulations put in place. So just to be brief, because I am reaching the end of my time. So it is important again here, because there is a hard discussion there about the traditional farmers, but it is important to remind that there are many industries, such as in extractive or bio industry, that struggled with all these ethical issues related to the traditional rights and indigenous populations. There are global mechanisms that already exist through intellectual property, from access and benefits sharing for indigenous people, from royalty agreements, TRIP applications, or protection of traditional knowledge. So, but they exist, but they are possible because they function in a legal environment. And this legal environment is being set for the medical cannabis at a global scale. But nevertheless, we need to make sure that good examples are put in place of cooperation between traditional farming in the developing economies and the markets in developed economies, not to make the life harder for the people that are producing those kinds of substances, obviously, and moving the market elsewhere. So I just wanted to end my presentation by really sharing the encouragement of the members of the Global Commission. Unfortunately, the agendas of our members get full very early on, and I know that Cosmic Care has invited us very kindly, and we're very happy to be here, but unfortunately, none of the commissioners could be here. But it's also, they have make sure that we share the encouragements, their encouragements, for everyone to continue their work and forge ahead. I mean, people that are working on drug policy reform are policy pioneers, and this will be recognized globally in a few years. I mean, we have spent as a global population the last 50 years of our war on drugs building ways to really hurt people, thinking that that would deter them from using what was deemed and decided as illegal, as substances that are mind altering. So the hope of the Global Commission is that the next 5 and 10 years, we'll be trying to get new legal frameworks right and try to benefit socially, culturally, and economically the really most distressed populations that have suffered from the war on drugs. I would like to end on this, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Khalid, for your intervention. It's very important to hear this from an organization like the Global Commission. And it's really important, the work that you do. So now we will listen to Marta Pinto. Marta is a Portuguese psychologist who has experience of both outreach and clinical work with people who use drugs and sex workers. She's also a researcher and a professor at the University of Porto, both at the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences and at the Medicine School. Harm reduction and drug policy, particularly the Portuguese model, are in the core of her work. Marta is an activist for more than science-informed and humanistic public policies, and she's been doing scientific consultancy to parliamentarians and government officials in several countries. Unfortunately, at this time, Marta is finishing a class, and hopefully she'll be able to join us for the discussion, but she recorded a video with her presentation. And if anyone has questions for her, feel free to pose it, because we're confident that she'll be here on time to enter the discussion. So Inez will help us with the video. So let's give the floor to Marta.
So, hello, good afternoon. I want to thank for the invitation that Cosmic Care has kindly made me to be here, and I would like to compliment the other lecturers whose work in this area I know very well and I deeply admire. And I will also like to compliment all the people watching and participating. What you are watching now is a previously recorded video presentation, since I'm at the same time simultaneously giving a class at university. So I'm really sorry for that, and I'll do my best to join you as soon as I can at the debate. Everything I'll say here is based on my clinical and outreach experience in drug use as a psychologist, and in scientific data I've produced with my research teams as a researcher, and also on what is available on scientific literature. I won't be able to present this data, but I'll be very happy to share it with you. So if anyone is interested in getting in contact with me, please do. Well, the drug wars has failed on its original aims of preventing death, disease, and crime, and I won't be exploring much further this fact, because I'm sure that some of my colleagues here, because I know they do that, will do it tremendously well. So if you don't mind, I'll take that idea for granted and move on to ask if the war on drugs is being progressively recognized to be a part of the problem and not a part of the solution, what should come next? And I would say that we must move away as fast as we can from the bellic logic towards the peace paradigm, or the comprehensive approaches. We must recognize war always brings death and destruction, even if some historians do describe it as one of the major catalysts for change and development. And the war on drugs has certainly done it, brought death and destruction. With the war on drugs, we've learned that casualties were mostly concentrated among populations historically oppressed, like migrants, ethnic minorities, people living in the social and spatial margins of the cities, etc. The war on drugs has been a war on education, for example, a war on human rights among the most vulnerable, and it still is, unfortunately. It actively contributes to the construction and reproduction of social disadvantages. Just as an example, which is not absolutely obvious, Blammenson, regarding education, Blammenson and Nielsen stated in 2002 that in the 90s, educational deprivation became a weapon in the drug war, resulting in the denial of high school or college opportunities to tens of thousands of students. While Americans were arguably more committed than ever to the ideal of universal education, the drug war has effectively withdrawn this commitment to many children who were most at risk. The war on drugs has been an instrument of surveillance and social control over those social groups, and a tool to achieve geostrategic aims by legitimizing the political interference of powerful countries over others. I am a peace psychologist, so I'm deeply engaged in building positive peace in the most widest sense of the term, to create the necessary environmental conditions for social justice and equality, and to promote the self-accomplishment of every single human being, without exception, to make it possible for each of us to achieve our maximum potential and dignity. We all as a society would gain from that experience, I don't doubt it. And as stated in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, no one can be left behind, regardless behaviors such as the use of psychoactive substances. In fact, humanity has always used psychoactive substances. It is an anthropological and historical fact, and drug use was in the majority of cases very functional during all those centuries and among the different human cultures. Problems did not arrive until the 19th century and the modern industrialized world, except for alcohol, perhaps. The reasons for the diabolization processes of the use of particular substances are not grounded in their potential risks or pharmacological properties, as the Global Commission on Drug Policy so clearly demonstrated in the last year's report. But otherwise, they are driven by social and cultural complex dynamics linked to prejudice against particular social groups who historically faced distrust, oppression, and exclusion. In the war on drugs, as I said, the ones who get sick, the ones who die, the ones who are arrested, the ones who are kicked off the educational systems tend to be always the same. Repressive drug policies fuel and sustain structural violence through social inequality or racism, for example, and we must put an end to this. But if that's the case, then what should be the more adequate drug policy model? I live in a country, Portugal, which is given as a drug policy example, and I totally agree with the idea that it clearly is one of the best possible contemporary approaches. We went for the decriminalization of the use of all psychoactive substances in the beginning of the century, and the country has improved enormously since the reform regarding drug conventional indicators. Those are HIV and hepatitis C and TB incidence rates, substance use over time, especially among young people, search for treatment for substance use disorders, drug-induced deaths, imprisonment rates, problematic drug use, health-related costs, and so on. On the other hand, with decriminalization, drug prices in the black market did not went down as drug use did not increase significantly, especially when compared to similar countries which did not decriminalize drug use. In 20 years, drug use phenomenon in this country has profoundly changed to a much, much better scenario. But is the Portuguese drug policy model a mere decriminalization model? It started with a very progressive national strategy prepared by a group of experts in a very participative process involving relevant stakeholders, including people who use psychoactive substances. And it was intrinsically informed by the pragmatism and the humanism spirit that characterizes harm reduction. Very often, the Portuguese drug policy model tends to be reduced to the legislative change that decriminalized drug possession and use, but it is far much more than that. Portugal has a relatively good coverage and accessibility of harm reduction programs and a highly complex and territorial strategy that tries to address in an integral and integrative way all the needs of people who use psychoactive substances, their families, and their communities. The general purpose of the policy is really to understand and to support and not to punish. In a recent study we've made called DURES, a narrative project funded by CICAD, the Portuguese official organism to respond to drug use, we accompanied around 25 people who use or used drugs who are included in opioid substitution programs through health diaries for several months. And in the majority of cases, we could see how the approach is comprehensive. In many cases, although not in all, people described, for example, their relationship with the health carers as empathetic and helpful. But we've also learned other not so shiny things that I'll point out a bit later, although I think they are not a problem of the Portuguese model and the problem of the global framework for the drug policy. So Portugal has a comprehensive and integral approach in which decriminalization is just one of the elements to take in consideration. Of course, the model has some weaknesses I could point out, but that's not the aim in this narrative. I will be only focusing one of them, as you will see. So, If we accomplished so many things with the Portuguese drug policy model, is that the ideal we should aim for? In other words, is a good decriminalization model the best option? When facing more conservative and repressive alternatives under the prohibitionist paradigm, these approaches seem to be one of the best possible solutions, as I said. In fact, even the Portuguese drug policy model has been appropriated by some of the most conservative international bodies to support a narrative in favor of prohibitionism. Look, Portugal is the living proof that prohibitionism may work. But should this be the way to build our future? If we think about the indicators that science conventionally uses to evaluate drug policy, we can find incidence rates of infectious diseases, substance use over time, imprisonment rates, drug-induced deaths, search for treatment for substance use disorders, and so on. And I know this very well because I'm performing a series of synthesis studies on decriminalization models, so I know what kind of indicators are being used. And my question is, why are those the indicators being used? Those are maybe easier to collect, but they are also the ones more relevant, for example, for public health. And Michel Foucault showed how health is a major vehicle to legitimize control and power over populations. In brief, what I'm trying to alert to is that those indicators may well become social management tools, offering the individual the possibility to choose if he or she wants or not to use drugs. But at the same time, these policies neutralize his or her effects over the community. And there are a series of wonderful critical analysis of those neutralization processes if you want to go for them. So science, in my opinion, has a critical role when it comes to evaluate drug policy and to design good policies. What about using indicators like socioeconomic reinsertion, citizenship, stigma and internalized stigma, self-perceived well-being, sense of belonging, inequality in the access of the general health to the general health system? I will assure you that we would find a dark side if we used those indicators. In my research, through the health diaries, for example, we could clearly see that we must improve our efforts to potentiate meaningful social inclusion and citizenship among people who use or used drugs. Environmental factors like stigma, poverty, social inequality, racism are the structural roots for the problems we want to solve. Imprisonment rates, drug-induced deaths, infectious diseases, unemployment, social exclusion, and even chronic addiction are often, very often, the product of social reaction to drug use and not to drug use itself. That's why drug use is a transversal and somewhat common behavior in our societies, but addiction tends to intensively affect the most socially vulnerable. And also recovery is much more difficult among those, because once again, environmental factors play a crucial role in these processes. What is then the main weakness in decriminalization models? In my point of view, the main weakness is not inherent to decriminalization, but something that derives from the contemporary global framework for drug policy, which is prohibitionism and the war on drugs. The problem with prohibitionism and decriminalization is that the situation improves or may improve spectacularly, but mostly on those social control indicators I mentioned before. And That's absolutely crucial. Of course, we want less people to get ill, less people to die, less people to go to jail, etc. Nevertheless, it does not tackle the underlying structural factors behind the problem, maintaining drug use as a catalyst for poverty and social inequality, discrimination, social exclusion, in short, legitimizing structural violence. It is, if you wish, a mere symptomatic approach. What happens then is that the most socially disadvantaged may keep being exposed to profound suffering related to isolation, to a senseless life, to being regarded by society as supernumerary or as a social weight. We could capture that in our researches, that subjective experience is very present, and it allows us to understand that we can take care of health and be legally protective, but without focusing on human rights and citizenship and on environmental factors like the social reaction to the use of certain substances, we will miss the point, the most important point. Many of those persons internalized stigma and truly believe they are not worth living. In some cases, they even spoke as if they were already dead, although they were in a recovery process, although they were abstinent. So this means that, and I'm going to finish, sorry, 1 minute. This means that despite of all its gains, decriminalization is still built upon the drug fallacy imposed by the international treaties, which relies on an unreasonable, illogical, passionate, and emotional positioning against the use of certain psychoactive substances seen as inherently harmful, and a tolerant positioning towards others that are seen as innocuous or even beneficial. Decriminalization as well as harm reduction are fundamentally addressing for many times the risks and the harms of the wrong policies, drug policies, of social intolerance to diversity and not of drug use itself. And this must be affirmed and dealt with once and for all. To improve drug policy, I think we should keep on trying very responsible, controlled, and very cautious experiences of regulation, but to introduce also a more comprehensive, human rights-based, scientific approach when it comes to evaluate the corresponding impact of policies. Thank you so much, and sorry for 2 minutes. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Marta. Marta is still not here with us, but I will definitely thank her for her perspective. I think it's always very important to hear a different perspective on the decriminalization model and also of how it's being evaluated. For us at Cosmic Care particularly, this is a debate that we have lots of times because we are mainly a harm reduction NGO. And when you're working in harm reduction, it's very important to actually reflect upon which interests are you serving. And if you're working mainly for the government as a means of social control and only towards a health imperative that we know that it's far from being the motivation to use drugs. And so we should always take a political stand. And we see that some harm reduction collectives are quite political, some not so much. And at least in Portugal, this is quite a relevant debate. And you see that it's not happening all over. So thank you very much for this input. It's very valuable, and we'll pass on to our next guest, which is Steve Rolls. Steve is a senior policy analyst for Transform Drug Policy Foundation, a UK-based think tank and charity that's focused on drug policy and law reform, and he's been working there for over 20 years. Steve has extensively published on the subject of drug law reform and drug regulation, including the 2009 Blueprint for Regulation, 2014 How to Regulate Cannabis, a Practical Guide, and the upcoming How to Regulate Stimulants, a Practical Guide. He has served as an advisor for the Global Commission on Drugs and the Uruguayan, Canadian, Mexican, and New Zealand governments in developing their cannabis regulation models. And he'll speak a little bit to us about how could we actually start moving things along. Steve, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Helena. It's great to come after such amazing speakers because they've laid a fantastic foundation for what I'd like to say. And I endorse absolutely, I think, every single word that the previous three speakers have said. I'm going to try. I'm going to in my 15 minutes. I'm going to try and focus in more specifically on when we talk about regulation, what is it we actually mean? To try and sort of unpick some of the nuts and bolts, because I think the critique of the war on drugs has become very detailed and very eloquent and has achieved real mainstream traction. I think there's a widespread public and political and media view that the war on drugs doesn't work, that it's counterproductive. I think that's very well understood. But to move beyond that critique to alternative policies, what a lot of people say, let's end the war on drugs, but what does that mean? And for me, it doesn't just mean decriminalization. I think Marta put it very well, that decriminalization is only a part of what needs to happen. It's important, and what's happened in Portugal is fantastic, but it only deals with half the problem. It doesn't deal with the problems of the illegal market itself. And to deal with that, we need to replace the illegal market with a legal market that needs to be regulated in some way. But when we go to that then begs a whole series of secondary questions. How do you regulate it? How do you regulate different drugs? How do you regulate different drugs in different places? And so I'd like to just run through a few of these concepts. I think the first thing to say that's useful to flag is that legalization and regulation are not really the same, and it's useful to make that distinction. Legalization is essentially a process by which the prohibition of a substance is ended, and it allows it to be regulated. But the important thing about legalization is that it's a process of something that's illegal becoming legal. It's not actually a policy endpoint in itself. The nature of the regulation that follows legalization still needs to be specified. Regulation itself, that describes how states legally control the market for a particular drug or activities related to the drug after it has been legalized, or if it is legal. And that's the control which usually involves a combination of things like licensing, taxation, pricing controls, and global controls on aspects of things like marketing and packaging and sales to children. And each one of those elements of regulation needs to be unpicked, and there's a lot of detailed work that needs to be done there. And I think it's an important thing to be clear that regulation isn't a single thing, and that the devil is very much in the detail, and each one of those elements needs to be discussed and debated, and we need to look at the evidence from other fields: alcohol regulation, tobacco regulation, regulation of other risky products and other risky behaviors, things like gambling, things like sex work, things like dangerous sports, and regulation of foods and pharmaceuticals. And from all of that, we actually have a really quite amazing body of knowledge and scholarship. And it's one of the things that governments do, and for the most part, they do it reasonably well. And in many cases, they do it very well. And we know how to regulate things. We know how to regulate. We know how to regulate risk and to manage risk. And because we elect governments to do that, it's one of the key functions of government is to regulate things. That's what we want them to do. But the context now is that we've got to this point where the critique of legalization, the critique of the war on drugs rather, has become very politically potent and very mainstream. If we are going to talk about regulation, we need to be able to do it in a coherent way. We need to be able to present a vision of an alternative to the war on drugs that is credible, that people can buy into, that policymakers can believe in, that the public can understand, and that popular movements can find messages and framing that they can get behind it and take it forward. And it's not easy, because regulation, it is complex, and some of it is quite dull, really, and it doesn't have, in many ways, it doesn't have the kind of visceral narrative of the war on drugs. You know, drugs are evil. We will fight them. Let's declare war on these evil drugs. And you know, if you're talking more about some of the details of sort of bureaucratic regulation detail, it's you know, it's quite off-putting in some ways, but we need to be able to do that, and we need to be able to talk about it in compelling ways. And I guess but the key thing is, it is now happening. I'm just going to put up a little slide here. It is very much a reality. You know, when I started in this work, I'm horrified to say nearly 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, there was no drugs have been legalized anywhere, and then sort of in 2012 there was this sort of threshold moment. In some ways it came before that. I think 2011, I think it was, Khaled, when the first Global Commission report came out, or 2010. Suddenly you had all these world leaders and, you know, people like Kofi Annan suddenly saying, yeah, we should start talking about legalization and regulation. That was a watershed moment. But really 2012, when Washington and State and Colorado State legalized cannabis, they were the first jurisdictions to legalize and regulate any formerly illegal drug. So this was a really key turning point. And since then, the pace of change has accelerated. Uruguay became the first country. Bolivia legalized coca. You started to see a sort of domino effect of US states legalizing cannabis. I think 2018 was a big moment because Canada was the first sort of major G7 country, the first big kind of international player to legalize cannabis. More recently, we've seen Mexico and South Africa. I mean, they're still in the process of doing it, but they've seen cannabis prohibition struck down in the constitutional courts on kind of on the basis of personal autonomy, kind of human rights cases. And beyond that, it's not just all been cannabis. I mean, we've seen Bolivia and coca. We've more recently seen a number of US states de facto legalize psychedelic plants and magic mushrooms. New Zealand is probably going to legalize cannabis next year. Luxembourg has announced that they're going to be legalizing cannabis. So we're seeing a sort of domino effect. It's moved from the margins of the public debate to the mainstream, and it's moved from theory to reality. But if we're talking about regulation, we need to say, we need to be really clear what it is. And be clear that regulation at its core, it's about managing risk. That's what regulation is. It's about managing and minimizing risk. And it's one of the key things that governments do. And the motive for it is the public good. And we can break that down a bit in a minute. But it's very important to make that distinction between regulation by governments in the interest of the public good and legalization, of a sort of free market model of legalization, where the motive is private profit. And there is this tension between commercialization and regulation, commercialization in the interest of private profit and regulation in the interest of the public good. And there's a tension that plays out there. We see it with alcohol and tobacco. We see it now with cannabis, and we're going to see it with other drugs as we move forward. I think this point here I've clocked here is that there isn't a single one-size-fits-all model of regulation. As I already said, different drugs will be regulated in different ways according to how risky they are and the particular risk behaviors in a particular place. And obviously environmental, cultural and economic factors are going to come into play as well. And also regulation, it establishes the parameters of what is allowed and what's not allowed. And the things that exist outside of those parameters, say, sales of drugs to children, for example, would remain prohibited. So so legalization or regulation or legal regulation, it doesn't mean that everything is allowed. Some things do remain prohibited or subject to sanction of some kind. It seems like a stupid thing to, almost pointlessly silly thing to point out, but we need to say, why are we regulating? Regulation, legalization, regulation of drugs isn't an end in itself. The reason we're doing it is because we want to see better we want to see better outcomes and I've just summarized it here, that we want to see better public health outcomes, we want to see reduced crime, corruption and violence, we want to see improved security and development. Nationally, we want to see populations more effectively protected, we want to see the protection enhancement of human rights, and we want, you know, taxpayers and civilians want to see good value for money. They want to see evidence-based policy from their government that reflects effective expenditure. Now, those are all obvious things, you know, everybody is going to agree with them. And I think it's useful if we're talking about this with people who don't necessarily agree with it, to say, look, this is what we're trying to do. And then you can use that as both the basis for making the case for regulation, but also the basis for making the critique of the war on drugs, because transparently, the war on drugs doesn't do any of those things. And even a cursory look at the evidence. And, you know, the Global Commission and things like the Count the Costs project have produced a whole series of publications which lay out in very graphic terms the failure of the war on drugs on all of these points. And I think we need to make the case, you know, it depends on who your audience is, obviously, but we need to make the case for change on the basis that regulation and progressive moves towards regulation of ultimately all drugs would better meet our shared aims, which I've put up here. The question then is also, what do we regulate? And again, when you break it down, it's very obvious. We regulate the same things we do for illegal drugs that we do for legal drugs, or pretty much any legal products. We regulate their production and transit, who is allowed to make and transport them. We regulate the products themselves in terms of their dosage or their preparation or their pricing, packaging requirements, you know, warning labels, that kind of thing. We regulate the vendors. Would we have licensed vendors? Would there be certain training requirements for the vendors? We need to regulate the outlets. Where would they be located? Would you have online outlets with delivery services? If they're physical outlets, what would they look like? What kind of signage would they have? When would they be able to open? And, you know, would they be near schools, for example, or would there be zoning restrictions? We need to regulate the marketing, things like advertising and branding and promotions. And perhaps in some ways, most importantly, we need to regulate the users. Who has access? How would you establish who has access to those products and markets? Things like age controls or controls on people who are already intoxicated. And these are obviously all things that we already do with alcohol and tobacco and many other products and services. So they're all things that we know quite a lot about, a great deal about. We just need to apply that logic and that knowledge and that scholarship to a group of products and markets that, for weird historical reasons that some of the speakers before me have alluded to, have sat outside the regulatory logic of more conventional products. And we have this whole flexible menu of options that can be applied to different drugs in different environments. This is a graphic that we use quite a lot because I find it quite a useful way of explaining some of the key ideas that we're trying to get across here, which is the y-axis up the sides is social and health. You go the greater the social and health. X-axis is kind of a spectrum of drug policy options, from hardcore war on drugs over there on the left, all the way through to a kind of free market legalization all the way over on the right. And you move through kind of prohibition with harm reduction, decriminalization, which I guess is where Portugal is. And you see, as you move from the left to the right, you see the social and health harms are going down to strict legal regulation, which is kind of where we would advocate the market needs to be in the middle. This is the kind of optimal point. But then there is actually a risk, is if you keep moving, you can move towards under-regulated legal markets. So if you move, then you get to light legal regulation, and then you get right over there on the right, which is maybe where, for example, tobacco markets were in the 1950s, effectively a free market commercial promotion of a very dangerous drug. And you get then social and health harms emerging from under-regulation, a bit like the under-regulation you get under prohibition, but from a different, in a different context. But the thing they have in common, markets controlled by organized crime or markets controlled by poorly regulated corporations is that they are operating in the interest of public profit rather than public health. Moving on, I just need to keep an eye on the time. I've only got a couple of minutes left. We've produced a whole series of publications, and I'll point you to those just in a moment before I finish. But we've tried to outline what different regulation models might look like for drugs associated with different levels of risk. And this slide, in very simple terms, we've gone into a lot more detail in our written work, summarizes that. And going from the top to the bottom, the most restrictive model is a kind of medical prescription model. And we know about prescribed methadone and prescribed heroin programs, and there are some prescribed stimulant programs as a form of treatment or harm reduction intervention. So we do already have a legal supply model for injectable heroin and for methamphetamine, for example. So some of the drugs that are the most sort of demonized and feared drugs of all, we do actually already have legal regulatory models for their supply to people who use drugs, albeit within a heavily restricted medicalized framework. Moving down, a specialist pharmacist model, I think this is quite an appealing one. It's effectively a retail model, but the gatekeeper of access would be a trained individual, rather like a pharmacist, who not only enforces a regulatory code, but would also be trained to give, health and risk reduction and harm reduction advice. Moving down again to number 3 is licensed retailing. This is basically like off-license sales of alcohol or tobacco or cannabis, I guess, in some of the legal cannabis jurisdictions, where you have different types of regulation, but essentially it's a commercial market that operates within certain license conditions. The 4th option is licensed sales within where you have premises for consumption as well, things like alcohol bars and coffee shops. And finally, for the least dangerous drugs, we're talking about things like coffee and cocoa tea. You effectively have unlicensed sales. They would be more like groceries or supermarket sales. So I'm gonna finish there because I think I am running out of time. Is that right, Helena? Am I running out of time?
Yes, Steve, I just send you a little message saying.
Oh, did you? I didn't get a message because I'm sharing screen. But I guess
I'll give you an extra 3 minutes.
That's okay. I can finish now. We can dig into some of this in the discussion.
We have a lot of questions, so it would be nice if we could go to.
Yeah, no, I'll stop. I mean, but basically, we do have a load of publications. They're all freely available on our website. That dig into some of these things I've been talking about and contextualize them in the context of some of the other discussions that have been going on. I don't want to make it seem like we're just these kind of regulatory nerd automatons. We do contextualize these things within the sort of human rights context and the development context and so on. But we produce these publications. They're available in English and Spanish. The stimulants book on the end there isn't published for a couple more weeks, so you'll have to hold on for that one. But yeah, this stuff is all there. It's all free to download. You don't have to buy it. And yeah, that's kind of what Transform does. So do check out our resources. And I think I will stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Steve, for your presentation. It's always very interesting to listen to you. And I'm very anxious to see your new report on stimulants. Actually, I think we'll probably have time to debate that a little bit during the discussion. But as far as drug regulation go, we're starting to see a lot of experiences with cannabis. And we also see some type of exceptionalism towards psychedelics and around psychedelics, but not really concerning other substances. And maybe this is useful from a strategic point of view, and eventually I would like to hear you comment on that. But I think it's very interesting that models are starting to appear and think about models for other substances, for other users. So thank you very much. And now, without further delay, I'm gonna pass the word to my next speaker, Zara Snap. Zara, thank you for coming and joining us. Zara is the co-founder of Instituto RIA, a Mexican organization that advocates for drug policies based in development, human rights, and social justice. She's a board member of Reverdecer Colectivo, an international advisor of Acción Técnica Social in Colombia. Zara has a master's in public policy from Harvard University and a bachelor's in political science from the University of Colorado at Denver. She is the author of The Dictionary of Drugs and in numerous articles and book chapters. Thank you so much, Zara. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Elena. And yeah, I'm so happy to be here with people that I admire and that I work with, and that usually we see each other in person, but this is very nice to be able to be brought together with Steve, Khalid, Marta, and Zhao. And yeah, I'm just excited to be here. I also had the pleasure of being able to work with the Global Commission for many years during the UNGAS process. And so I'm very grateful that they continue to just be very supportive of all the work that civil society is doing. I'm gonna share my screen because I did create a presentation. I'm gonna be speaking primarily about, you all can see my screen, yeah? I'm going to be speaking about the experience in Mexico because we are taking these kind of abstract theories and hypotheticals that Steve has been working on for the last 20 years and really trying to apply what that looks like. And I think it's evolved a lot in the last 20 years as well, in the sense that we talk about over-commercialization and we talk about what needs to how to bring people with us in this road to regulation. And here in Mexico, what we're trying to do is to integrate social justice into every part of the legislation that is currently being discussed. So I'm going to jump right in. You already said what we do. We're a Mexican organization and we do primarily advocacy and research, and a lot of movement building right now, because that's the work that needs to be done here in Mexico. And I think all around the world is how do we get while many political changes have taken place, it's really a cultural change where people stop being afraid of substances, stop being afraid of these plants, and stop being afraid of people who use drugs, so that we can really make a larger cultural shift. So just to give you all a slight overview of what's happened in Mexico in the last 13 years, in 2006 is when they did a militarization of public security and the launch of the war on drugs with then President Calderon. This has definitively been continued with the next administrations of Enrique Peña Nieto, and I would say that even more, and also with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who has now created the National Guard, and many of them are engaged in anti-drug trafficking operations and in just general militarization. So we continue to fight against those policies, and we see drug policy reform as essential to that. And I really loved what Marta said about positive peace, because that's one of our main goals here too. Have had widespread human rights violations. Here you can see some of the data, 34,000 homicides only in 2019. It was the year with the most homicides in our recent history. And these most recent months, even while we've been on quarantine, homicides continue to be quite high, over 100 people killed a day. And just in the last couple of days, there was a man who was killed in Guadalajara for not wearing a face mask, and he was detained by police officers, beat and tortured for 3 hours and died. And so now there are protests in the streets in Guadalajara. I expect protests to be taking place in Mexico City in the coming days. And it's just one of these things where we are seeing reflected what's going on in the United States. It's reflected here in Mexico too. And so since 2000, we've had more than 61,000 people who've been disappeared in these years of war. And these are official numbers, although we expect them to be much higher because we expect there to be data that isn't even being collected around people who are being disappeared, and many of them being disappeared by government forces. And so we're really seeing this abuse of authority and the use of force throughout the country that is very concerning. More than 250,000 people have been displaced because of violence. I'm sorry, I translated this last night and I see there's some words there still in Spanish. Torture cases increased by 600% between 2003 and 2013. And so we really see systematic human rights violations increasing. UN rapporteurs have come here and they've said it. It doesn't seem to change the situation. So we really need people to be demanding that this changes, because we see that from an international level, that kind of pressure sometimes doesn't have the impact that one would need. The Instituto Belisario Dominguez, which is part of the Senate, in 2016 estimated that regulating cannabis would affect between 25 and 30% of the revenue of organized criminal groups. We really have no idea how much that would be actually, because there's also such a diversity of groups that are engaged in illegal activities, whether that's simply extortion, which is the easiest thing for groups to take on, and extorting primarily small stores, or groups that are really engaged in international drug trafficking and that have then ties to Colombia in order to move cocaine through Mexico to get to the United States and Canada. The war on drugs is a war on people. I think we all know this. In Mexico, just so you have an idea of the official data of people who are using drugs, 9.9% of the population had used an illegal drug sometime in their life. That's very low. We expect it to actually be much higher, but we, in general, Mexico tends to consume much more alcohol than drugs that are currently illegal. 2.9% had consumed in the last year, and only 1.5% had consumed in the last month. These are also surveys that they do house to house. And so when they come to you and your family is there and they ask you whether you've used illegal drugs, that you might not say whether you have or not. Although we do advocate for people coming out of the psychoactive closet. It is very difficult and we recognize it. And right now in these quarantine conditions where we are living 24 hours a day with families, we recognize that it is even harder to be a person who uses drugs because you might be having to hide your activities. Even I've had to deal with it with my mother, who knew for years that I use drugs and I work in this, but it's still conversations that you have to continue having with family members and your community. So we are the second or third largest cannabis producer I'm going to focus on cannabis today, but we believe, and my organization advocates for the regulation of all currently illegal plants and substances. And we strongly believe in that. And for Mexico, the next plant that we will look at regulating will be poppy, which is used to make heroin and other substances. But for now, I'm going to focus only on cannabis because that's the mandate I was sent, and also because that's what we're moving more quickly with here in Mexico. So we are the second or third largest producer after Morocco, and so sometimes we change. We have between 15 and 27,000 tons that are produced annually, and this covers almost 115 hectares. Although, you know, this is all the data that you get from the UN that you're never quite sure if it's real, because they're basing this data on eradication. And there could be that there are many more hectares that are being cultivated that they don't even have on their radar. It primarily does occur in the states of Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango, although all of the following states also have cannabis cultivation. So when we talk about how we got to this point, and Steve mentioned it, it really was through the judicial branch. So the Supreme Court of Mexico determined in 2015, with a strategic litigation process that began in 2012. So it took us 3 years to get from just kind of beginning to take a case to get to the Supreme Court, that argued that the cultivation, harvesting, preparation, possession, and transportation for personal use is authorized without considering commercialization. So this was the SMART case. And what it determined is that the prohibition, the absolute prohibition of cannabis in Mexico, was violating our constitutional right to the free development of personality. So, and the right to autonomy. So that was the first case where it really came out, and they were very clear about it. They, then in the media it came out, Mexico has legalized cannabis. No, it just was struck down once. In Mexico, in order to get to jurisprudence, you have to have 5 consecutive cases using the same criteria and with the same number of votes. So several years later so the lawyer who won this case of the SMART case, Andres Aguinaco, along with folks from Mexico United Against Crime, Andres immediately began looking for other cases to take to the Supreme Court. So the next case that came was in 2018. In 2018, it all kind of happened because we needed those 3 years. So we got all of the consecutive cases. I won a case in the second court, which there's a first court and a second court. The second court sees more administrative matters. And so my case was about, once we've extended this right of cultivating under the right of the free development of personality, how does one get the seeds, acquire the seeds in order to then cultivate, because the seeds are illegal in Mexico. So my case was administratively around how do I access the seeds. So the 31st of October, the final cases were resolved in favor, and they published the jurisprudence in February 2019. And this obligates any district judge to resolve subsequent cases in the exact same manner. And so then you don't have to get to the Supreme Court to win your case. You can go to a judge. And essentially what you do is you go to the regulatory agency, you ask for permission to cultivate for personal use. They will deny you that permission. And then you go to a judge to sue the state saying that they're violating your right. They also sent a mandate to the Congress to legislate on this issue within 90 days. The first deadline was October 31st, 2019. The Senate did not reach that deadline. They asked for more time. So the Supreme Court gave them until April 31st, 2020. Then the pandemic hit. And so they now have given them another extension until December 15th, 2020, which is the final day of our final legislative session of the year. So they have to pass something by then. And I'm going to talk about what they're proposing to do. And I had a clock going. Let me get back to it. Timer. Oh, I'm so far. Okay, so on March 4th, the bill was approved in committees, the Committee of Justice, Health, and Legislative Studies. And so, but it was approved in general terms, and they're still arguing about the particularities or the actual articles. We advocate for regulation within a social justice framework. We believe that a social justice framework needs to be there, and what means that we need to actively confront dynamics of privilege and oppression, which is something that, I, as a white woman in Mexico, I was born here, but I grew up in the United States. I'm able to talk about my use without having repercussions. There are many people in this country who are not able to do that, and we strive then to recognize the privilege and the oppression that exists in these relationships. Recognize the existence of groups that have been historically and currently marginalized, which is primarily communities that cultivate cannabis or poppy, generate affirmative and retributive actions to balance the level of justice, and designate resources towards reparations. This is, for us, number one. If this does not happen, then we don't really want regulation. So we have won many things in this whole process of advocating. We were part of the original bill or original law that was submitted by Olga Sanchez Cordero, who's now one of our ministers. And so we were able to help with the drafting of that. And it still maintains these 3 access routes: cultivation for personal use with 4 plants per person. And then if you have another adult, you can have up to 6 plants. And there's a permitting process. We are against the permitting process because we don't think anyone should have to get a permit to have their own right. And we also believe that this number of plants is quite low. If you had won one of the cases that I previously mentioned through the judicial process, there was no limit to the plants you could have. The cannabis associations are also contemplated, although they only allow up to 20 members, and those 20 members can have up to 4 plants. The number of plants, and then there's the regulated market, which I'm going to speak to. The thing about the regulated market is that it doesn't contemplate public spaces for consumption, and we know that many of the people who consume in public spaces is because you're young, you live with your family, they might kick you out if they knew you consumed. And so we really need to figure out how do we deal with some of those issues that might come up and that continue to be discriminatory or discretional on the part of the authorities. So it creates the Instituto Mexicano del Cannabis. So this is a decentralized organism that is connected to the Secretary of Governance, where Olga Sanchez Cordero is the minister of that secretariat. And it has its own legal personality and its own budget, which is determined by the Congress every year. And it also decides who, what, how, and when businesses can participate in the production chain. They contemplate 5 different types of licenses: cultivation, transformation, commercialization, export and import, and research. In reality, they don't need to have a research license because there already exist protocols of research protocols that they should just be transferring to what cannabis is going to look like. But what they could do is add in another license around analysis and testing, because we want to make sure that those folks only have that license. It's also important to note that one of the things that we gained after many years of advocating for this, and that was in the bill from the beginning, is that there's a limit on vertical integration. And what this means is that you can only have one type of license. If you are a business, you cannot have all types of license. So it's trying to break up any sort of monopoly that could exist. Unless, I'll just pass by this, unless, and this is the article that's important, you are part of a community of indigenous people and communities, peasants or ejido owners in municipalities in which during the period that cannabis was prohibited, eradication was performed on your crops. And if eradication was performed on your crops, 40% of the cultivation licenses will go to those communities. Our goal is to increase that to be 80%. But so it's already is taking into account that 40% of those licenses should go to these communities. And those communities will be allowed to have vertical integration. So they will be able to take advantage, full advantage of transforming and selling the products that they make. So we are trying to find ways for them to, this isn't about everyone having the same capacity or opportunity. This is about folks who are already in the illegal market being able to transition to a legal market and to fully take advantage of that shift. There continue to be very high fines for consumption in public spaces. There continue to be very high fines if you are carrying above 28 grams. And then if you're carrying above 200 grams, you have, oh, there's my timer. Then you have criminal penalties. So we would like to get rid of that. Look, I have one, this is just how they're planning on implementing this. Our concern, so they're immediately import, export for medical use, immediately permits to people for cultivation, and immediately research licenses. However, cultivation would wait until you have guidelines in place, and you have to register any seeds that you plan on using with a general seed. We already have a seed bank here in Mexico for different seeds. Within 6 months, non-psychoactive cannabis, so hemp, and within 18 months, cannabis association licenses, and within 18 months, transformation and commercialization licenses for psychoactive cannabis for adult use. We would want the cannabis associations to be able to happen immediately, because it would literally be opening an organization, going through the same process that we go through as a civil society organization to be part of this. So my conclusions, and I'm sorry because I had to rush, but is really that we still are proposing changes, but we want this bill to pass. We believe that this will change the status quo, and this will shift how we're thinking about it, and it will be an experience that other countries will be able to take away. Mexico will be the first country to really move in this direction, who has a history of production and cultivation illegally, and sending out to exporting to other countries. And so we want to remove the licenses for self-cultivation, increase the number of plants, increase the percentage of licenses for cultivation for affected communities, change so that cannabis associations can begin immediately, because we see that as an important alternative to the commercial market. We believe that there should be a counterbalance to the commercialization, and include a citizen council in the governing board within the Instituto Mexicano. So we want to make sure that there's also checks and balances with how this is going when they create this new institution, as well as include a transitory article on the release of people incarcerated for cannabis offenses as something that is key to include. These are just some of the things we've done. You know, we did a colloquio of people who use cannabis in the Senate as part of the open parliament process. We've done photo shoots to show what it looks like when people use cannabis, you know, in a responsible way, and some of the activities that we've done as a coalition. The last thing I just want to say, anyone can reach out to me if they have questions, is that also with with Acción Técnica Social in Colombia, we've also been working on proposals around cocaine regulation, and so happy to chat about that if there are questions that have to do with that around stimulants. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zara, for your presentation. You pointed out really, really interesting things, and I was here just thinking when you talked about the Supreme Court in Mexico. I did a post-graduation in human rights law, and I'm not a lawyer or anything, but one of the works I did was about that the Constitution in Portugal allowed us the free development of our personality, and so it couldn't deny us the possibility of using drugs. And
Exactly,
my
and it could be extended to other substances.
other substances. At the time I did, but maybe João can help us understand, because my colleagues mostly were lawyers, but they weren't in the drug field at all, and they were a bit shocked at the time with such a proposal. They thought it was quite weird, but the teacher thought it was funny at the time, and then just dropped it. It was in 2009, and people just thought, oh, she's like a freak, and she's not even a lawyer.
No, you should have taken it. You should have
But yeah,
taken it.
it's very interesting. But maybe João can help us out in that. Let's see what he has to say, since he's a lawyer, and maybe he can help us with this here in Portugal. So I'll pass the word to João. Let me just present you. João Taborda da Gama is a lawyer, a policy advisor, and a law professor. João is founding partner of Gama Gloria, a law firm based in Lisbon, and a senior advisor of the Albright Stonebridge Group in Washington, D.C. As a lawyer and political advisor, he focuses on innovative and frontier business models in technology and healthcare sectors, including controlled substances. João works with narcotic regulation since 2013, and he successfully advised global companies, governments, patients, and NGOs in all aspects related to the use, the production, and the trade of controlled substances in medical, religious, or recreational contexts. João is also a regular speaker on narcotics regulation around the world, and was recently interviewed at a live podcast at MGB's conference in Las Vegas. With João Albernaz Delgado, he also wrote The Regulation of Medical Cannabis in Portugal, which was published in 2019. He is a frequent commentator in the Portuguese media. He speaks twice a week in a political debate with the Lisbon mayor on a major radio station, and he has a weekly debate on national TV. João is affiliated with the Law School of the Portuguese Catholic University, where he regularly teaches on tax and regulatory issues, having recently taught the first course on the regulation of controlled substances in the country. João is also has been a political advisor to the President of Portugal and a member of the political government. So João, please, the floor is yours. We can't hear you. You have no sound. You have to turn on.
Sorry, I was turning on my phone. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Elena. And thank you for inviting me to be here with such good speakers that I heard. I'll be probably take less time as I'm standing not between us and the dinner, but between us and very smart questions, which is better food for thought. I will just share a few thoughts and doubts on regulation based on my views of what can happen in Portugal, but also of what is happening in the world right now. And I would start with something that's very obvious for all of us, but this COVID context also made me think again, which is regulation politicians act on fears they have, and on fears they perceive the majority of the population has. And that explains the war on drugs if we have a superficial approach, but even if we go and see the war on drugs as war on people, it's also playing with the fears of the most affluent or the most numerous people in a society. And for me, what happened with COVID had also a part in playing with the fear of the population. I'm not judging if the fear is grounded or not, but just to see what in 2 months governments in both democracies and dictatorships could very easily do to a large amount of the population, restricting their rights, putting them inside the houses. So this was a reminder of that politicians play with fear, use fear, but also address the fear of the populations. And this when we talk about regulation, decrim, everything is very counterintuitive because the fear of drugs is still very entrenched. The fear that prohibition instilled in the people is still very, very active. In many countries more than others, but it's very, very, very powerful. The second thing I would like to share about this is that as Steve pointed out in his slide, we've seen a lot happening in the past years in various parts of the world with decriminalize policies, with de facto decriminalize policies. So many many district attorneys in many countries have de facto policies that are towards a more progressive stance on drugs, even though the countries are not in the law in the books. The law in the books is not progressive. So de facto, there are also some things that are happening. We see more on a theoretical point of view. Some of you have pointed out to that, but for the first time, we see the drug policy progressive thinkers in law, in political science, in sociology, speaking with the human rights, legal scholars, with the human rights theorists. We even see inside the United Nations the human rights gaining a momentum in terms of the thought on drug policy for the first time, which is rather surprising that it took so long to have these two hemispheres of the brain so separated inside the UN. And we see also some paradoxes happening here. We see, for instance, in the US, you have Donald Trump, and you had for a large period of his time Jeff Sessions, one of the fathers and arms of the war on drugs. But at the same time they were in charge, you had cannabis being liberalized at a rate that never happened before. And recently you had on plant medicine, on plant drugs, 2 or 3 initiatives, municipal initiatives, also under the oversight, let's say, of Trump, which is a paradox. And at the same time, you have the Portuguese Prime Minister at the time of the Portuguese drug policy, António Guterres, at the UN, and you don't see a lot of progress at the UN level. Of course, we know the Secretary General of the United Nations does not own the United Nations and does not dictate by itself the policy. We all know that. No one is so naive to think about that. But it's a kind of paradoxal times that we are living in terms of regulation, in terms of what's happening in the world. I would say that my perspective is that all that happens has influence in other countries, and so as Steve said, as regulation is not a goal in itself, all models have a benefit to the most important end, which is protecting lives and protecting and improving the lives of those more affected by the prohibition over the time and at a certain moment in time. And what I see that will happen is that countries will experience different roads to regulation, and maybe maybe what we've seen happening in Denver and in Auckland shows that some things will happen as a surprise. So if 2 years ago we asked what is the next step on regulation, is it Denver that will decriminalize mushrooms, or will it be Luxembourg that will regulate cannabis? Probably most of the betting would be on Luxembourg to be first, and it happened first of something that no one was expecting, and which for us that are invested in doing this shows that we have to keep an open and flexible tools and strategy, as things happen sometimes very fast, but also very unexpectedly. I believe that the road to regulation will be of this mix of, like, I don't want to use the concept of polydrug, but it's a poly liberalization models. So we will have religious advances. So many religions will have increasingly their substances recognized. We'll have some countries or part of the countries which will regulate recreation and spiritual uses, and we will have both mixes of. In the mix, we'll have both models of a more community-based and a more commercial base. And for my perspective is, for the end goal of everything, this mix is positive, which means that I believe that being very that must, because these models have different constituencies, it's not the same constituency that advocates for both models, let's say a purely commercial one or a purely religious or spiritual one. I think that bridges should be made among these constituencies. This is very for me very obvious in the so-called psychedelic space, more than, for instance, on the cannabis or on the regulation of other drugs, as the medical prescription of cocaine and ketamine and heroin. So this is also I think I wanted to share the question I have, the doubt I have, and I also throw that for discussion, is when we look at what happened in cannabis, there's at least a correlation between having large sums of money put into lobbying in cannabis and what happened in cannabis. And that is something that, if we have a less commercial approach to cannabis, we can see or understand as the end goal of everyone will be a larger liberalization and regulation of cannabis, which includes the adult use or / recreational market. So the medical market will be small, but of course companies are interested in adult use market, so they will push for a broader legalization. If we look at psychedelics, the opposite will happen. That's my interpretation, which means that the big push will be for the medical, because the medical is where the larger market is, more than on the recreational / spiritual, community-based, whatever use. So one question that from a general framework of pushing towards regulation is how can we push for regulation of substances where the money to be put in this procedure will probably stop when the commercial goal is achieved? Because in cannabis, there's a confluence in that. Of course, there's transitional justice problems, social justice problems. Profit is always a problem. We know all that, but in the end, we'll have more people accessing cannabis than on a medical only basis. On psychedelics and psychoactive substances, my fear is that it will stop once the medical goal is achieved, and then the initiatives will be relegated, will be probably shut down. What I see happening from my experience is that people are trying to develop mid-ground investment and mid-ground corporations, mixing both the goals of NGOs and the goals of social development investment funds or initiatives and commercial goals. I don't know if this will push for regulation or will delay regulation, but that's also what I see happening. The third and last idea I would like to share is that from a Portuguese, now it's from a Portuguese perspective. We don't have in Portugal, maybe unfortunately, a legal culture of either ballots and referendums, either policy driven by courts, which means that, as Helena said, and Marta also in her presentation, the Portuguese policy of 2000 was had a very specific momentum, but was led by a group of experts with top-level politician approval, and that's how it happened. We don't have like courts suing the state to allow cannabis access to a child patient or to his mother for self-cultivation. We don't have tradition that courts will impose, let's say, the use of LSD for depression. We don't have that culture. Many countries have it. We don't have that culture. In the countries where it happens, what we've seen with cannabis is that sometimes those activities, what happened like in Canada or in Germany, they pushed for a faster regulation, meaning when politicians are afraid that courts here and here and here, and it's also happening now in Brazil, are deciding in favor of patients' organizations, native people, whatever, it doesn't matter, for groups. So the state comes in and tries to give a kind of framework and regulation. That's more difficult to achieve. I was in the first part of this afternoon in another conference where we compared strategies in cannabis between Portugal and Brazil, and it's a totally different landscape, legal culture, which means that sometimes the arguments or the strategy is not, this is very obvious, but it's not translatable from one culture to the other for many reasons. But one is that the road to regulation sometimes is bottom up, sometimes is top down. Being said that, it's very important that what organizations like Cosmic Care and others have done at two levels with the drug policy in Portugal. The first level is to always remind and prove that what has been achieved with the decriminalized policy didn't create any of the fears that at the time was the major public concern, fears that Portugal will be transformed into no law zone, and that all the goals of the decrim policy will be the opposite. And so reminding that every time, because many people don't really remember what was Portugal in the 90s, because either they were too young or they were not working. That's happening now with younger policemen that did not work in the other context before the decriminalization policy. So they did not see what was very wrong with that. So reminding is very important. Doing harm reduction and showing that harm reduction works is very important. But also, and this is the last thing, is to inform politicians and decision makers of things that are very obvious to us. And I say that because I'm sure from this group of people, I was the last to come to drug policy. I'm the more recent person working with drugs and working on drug policy. So I'm still very much connected, and because of my job, to people that don't have a clue about what drug policy, irrespective if they're left or right, liberal or non-liberal. It's very difficult to predict how a person will think about this only by the political color or from. But what I know for sure is that these people, the average decision maker or a stakeholder that doesn't work in health or in drugs has no clue about things that are very, very obvious to all of us. Very, very obvious. And this is a very it's a truth that all strategy should never forget. Which is the member of parliament you are speaking to, the high court judge you are speaking to. Okay, he really doesn't know anything, and he doesn't know anything about cannabis, let alone psychedelics. So there's a huge work that's very easy, because it's just explaining what things that we've talked, and like pointing to Global Commission on Drugs, saying that there's a thing like Global Commission on Drugs where two, or well, now it's only three people speak Portuguese, and people are unaware of this. And this is something that I've seen helps regulate and legitimize and normalize things that are good, but we have to translate into arguments that the fear of a counterintuitive proposal, which is regulation, will block the fear of decision makers and the fear of what other people will think. Thank you. Is it time? Is the
Thank you, João. Thank you very much. And it was very interesting to listen to you, and it's good to have your perspective. And we had so many questions on our YouTube chat, and unfortunately we're short on time, so we're not going to be able to address all of them, but I tried to join some of the questions in 2 or 3 particular topics that I hope we can briefly discuss. And eventually the people that are listening can also reach out to our speakers and ask them personally some questions. But what apparently has driven people, I would also like to say that Marta is also here with us. She was able to join us. So Marta, thank you so much for your testimony. It was so nice to hear you. And please feel free to participate now in any way that you see fit. And I would make like this open question, and anyone that wants to participate can do it. I'm thinking more about Zara and Steve, but it picks up on something that João has said about this way of creating bridges between these 2 proposals of regulation models with different goals. One, that it's mainly a more capitalistic business model that is thinking about profit, and the others that most of us are at least working in this field probably want, which is a more social justice based model. And I was thinking that a lot of people in the chat also asked us about reparation and how would reparation be included in these models. And Zara also mentioned this in Mexico with the cannabis. But the thing is, when we look, for example, at the United States and at more business models, what we see is that before the legalization of the cannabis market, a lot of the people doing business were, for example, people of color. But once the business were legitimized and they're legal, we see that most people owning businesses are white people. So once again, once the business becomes legal, the people that were already involved in it and that were suffering most of the risks of providing us with the drugs that we use until now are now step aside. And also the people that are in jail, many of them are still in jail, although now the substance is legal. And I wonder if the businesses that are willing to put so much money are also willing to have this other part of society to participate actively in this new regulation models, and how all of you see this reparation issue, if there's even a reparation that can actually be done to all the suffering that so many people have endured. So with any of you would like to answer, I would ask you to keep it very short.
Yeah, I'm happy to go ahead and just say a few words. For us, that's been key. We live in a country where the prohibition of plants and psychoactive substances have had a huge impact on primarily poor communities, lower income communities, folks who dedicate themselves to the cultivation, people. I mean, we've justified human rights violations under the guise of the war on drugs. I mean, and we see this, and you mentioned a few cases in the beginning. So this is happening all the time around us. And so when we were beginning to draft different bills, it was something that we had to figure out, how do you integrate that into the bill? And so we, in our original proposal, was that 100% of the cultivation licenses would go to the social sector in Mexico, which is already defined in our law. And so they started with 20%. Now they've increased it to 40%, and we would increase it. And the minister, Olga Sanchez Cordero, the secretary, the minister of governance, had said, why isn't it 100%? And so we think that there is political will to privilege certain groups, but it really just depends on the legal framework. If it was 100%, then businesses could sue the government for creating these. I mean, the other thing that we're really looking at, and that if anyone who's watching us has information on how do we incorporate cannabis and other plants and psychoactive substances as they become regulated into the free trade agreements that our countries have already signed on to, and thus the restrictions that are being applied to us as countries. The other piece that we had hoped to include, but which was difficult because of our legal and tax structure, is how do you tag, how do you tax revenue? How do you etiquetar tax revenue? And in Mexico, you can't do that directly. You can't say that all the taxes that come in from cannabis go to the search for people who are disappeared. That's what we would have wanted, in addition to, you know, the regulatory structure that needs to be created. So what we've looked into is that it would be possible to create a fund, which then a certain percentage of that revenue goes to, that has certain, that could go to you know, the Commission on Attention to Victims, which is who tries to support, for example, the searches for people who are disappeared, because this is something that the government has not made a priority, and that for us, we also, and this is something that hasn't happened yet, we need a transition to be able to have transitional justice. And we haven't seen a change, a significant change in the strategy. And so all we see is individual groups going out and searching for their loved ones and in this work. And so we really need there to be that shift. And Marta, you weren't here, but the positive peace part, you know, we're trying to figure out how this relates to peace building and positive peace building. And that really has to come from communities up to the government. And so we've done some work around that, but, you know, we're trying to create as many legal constraints that can constrain the over-commercialization and the foreign investment that is very interested in Mexico. And how do we privilege people who are already in the illegal market? And I think it's working, because in Colorado and Washington, you know, if you had criminal justice, if you had criminal record, you couldn't participate in the legal cannabis market. And now that's changed. And Steve will be able to speak to this because they just did a webinar on it. But in Mexico, it's like, no, we actually want those people to be the first people. I want my dealer to be the dispensary owner. He's going to be great. And people are now coming out and saying, I'm a distributor, you know, I'm a cultivator. And that wasn't happening 2 or 3 years ago. So, but it is about creating conditions so that all of those people and communities can participate in the market. And it's a challenge. And you have to think about what your current laws allow you to do. And then how do you just keep pushing for more always, which is what we as civil society have to do.
I mean, I don't have really much to add to that. I think that's a very comprehensive answer from Zora. I mean, I think that a key point, though, is that, you know, what legalization creates is an opportunity, a unique, a historic opportunity to establish regulatory frameworks the way we want them to be. We don't have to reverse engineer them in the way we have with, you know, alcohol or tobacco or other markets that have been captured by profit-seeking corporate interests who don't operate in the public good. We do have this opportunity to do it differently. And I think it's somewhere that policy people, activists, people in the reform space, they have to grasp that opportunity early, because I think the window in which you can do that is really quite small. I think it's a narrow window of opportunity, because the potentially negative forces of big international capital and corporate capture will sweep in very, very rapidly. The window when social justice can be hardwired into the legislation is when the legislation is being drafted, and when the legislation is being discussed, and when the activism is shaping the nature of the discussion that informs the legislation. And that's now. We need to be doing that now, and that has to be why it has to be a priority for all activists now, not just to be you know, having these arguments. We need to be getting in there and shaping and framing this discussion now, so that we can shape these debates and shape the legislation and shape the markets the way we want it to be. It's an amazing opportunity, but we have to take it. And just Zara mentioned we've just released a report this week that looks at the social equity models for cannabis markets, reviews some of the successes and failings, challenges and pitfalls in the US, and we organised a webinar on that this week, which you'll be pleased to hear I wasn't involved in, so you won't have to look at my U-curve again. But it was very good. We had some really interesting voices from the US and the UK who were able to speak to both lived experience and kind of analysis around equity, and some of the people were very closely involved in it. So do check those out.
I just wanted to add also on this issue, because it is more of a political than a technical issue, which is surprising, Elena, that you wanted to look into the technicalities of it. This is something that we talk about in terms of, if you look at it, if you look at it from a macro perspective, this is very much about models that would succeed or fail. At the Global Commission, the members of the Global Commission are very happy that there are different models that are being implemented now and evaluated to see what works. But regardless, the reality is that you enter a market, and the difference between the other markets, tobacco, alcohol, and any other market, is that there isn't a huge $500 billion market that already exists. It is not a new industry. It's one of the oldest agricultural products that exists around there. People are there. And so Prohibition was based on unrealistic aims. You take a commercial model that does not respect the people that are in the place, it will be an unrealistic aim. So it is not really about a choice of those businesses. If you build a business that is based on a lie, and if your business model does dream of a global market when Prohibition and the international conventions do not allow for an international market, and all you can have is your national market, where your daily users already benefit from a very good supply system. They don't need to change the people that give them the product. So it is about, are you ready to take that risk? And are you ready to go and capitalize? And then when you have to see where the sales are, you have nothing. So it is about the successes and failures of policies. Prohibition still is successful because it brings a lot of different benefits, economic benefits to very powerful groups. It brings political benefits, etc. So it is about that, what is going to work or not, really. It is not about really much of a choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid. Thank you so much. Actually, this brings me to ask you a bit of an inconvenient question, but that a lot of people have actually raised about the Global Commission, which is the Global Commission has a lot of very, very high-profile people that were for many years, some of them in places where they could actually do a change. And usually they come and join the Global Commission when they are former presidents. What do you think it's here? Do you think this is all political? Do you think people at the end eventually see that the models that were in place failed? What's happening? How can we bring more people while they're on office to start and help us with this, with the legalization and the regulation of drugs? Instead of former presidents, we having actual presidents going on board with this.
No, thank you very much. I mean, the Global Commission, as just to do very briefly, it has started from the experience of really 3 Latin American former presidents, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. With the level, the war on drugs and the militarization, internal and also the hemispheric one, the policy in the hemisphere was getting into the level, and Zara spoke of the militarization, and we saw the terrible number, was getting to the level where the democratic institutions were endangered. And so there was a need to say that these policies do not work. A lot of people have been saying it since the 90s, but they need to come there and say it. Now, we have a variety of experiences. This is not something to forget about. We have the woman who has changed the face of drug policy in Europe, and who has, for example, when she was in power, tried to get the legalization of cannabis going through, but the parliament could not find consensus. We have also a former Colombian president who has tried as well to get into the regulation discussion, but the political situation with the peace agreement and other priorities did not allow him to go as far. We have also other people that have put in harsher laws, like the former president of Poland, and who came out and said, but I understood that this was not the response that I needed to give. We have the former president of Nigeria that has come out and has said that, but now that I looked at evidence and that I had sat there and he started working on drug policy with the other commissioners really against drug trafficking. That was the issue he saw in West Africa. But when he saw the evidence and understood that consumption now is there, that all the negative effects of prohibition are coming, he changed his mind. So this is about it. Now, this is something that also is evolving in the societies. I mean, we should not forget that, for example, the former political campaigns where we would use people who use drugs as the pawn and we attack them, etc., and the easy bridge, that no longer works. At the international level, when the United States decided to do a global compact, because that was at the general debate of the General Assembly, and to, global compact, a global call of action to make all the countries sign because of a political situation saying that this is the easiest topic that everyone has consensus on, and prohibition, everyone agrees. They have found themselves with very important countries not signing on because they have changed their mind and the way they do their policies, including Germany and other big European countries. So things are changing everywhere. Now, nevertheless, there is obviously, Trudeau administration in Canada campaign and etc. So it is evolving everywhere. Obviously, Mexico, we have Zara with us. That was also part of the campaign last time in Mexico and a big chunk of it. So this is the fact that this is what the global commissioners do. So the global commissioners, instead of wasting their time and saying we didn't do, we couldn't, etc. Now it is about going to the ground, learning, listening to the people, and taking this into the highest level of political level and advocating for that change. Obviously, advocating in the respect of the countries, of their sovereignty, and of the role of each one. But it is that bridge role that is very important for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid, very much. So also one of the questions that was raised here, and we'll almost ending, was about what you spoke, Marta, about the indicators that we are using to measure the success of our decriminalization policies, and eventually some of the indicators that are used to help prohibitionist policies to stay in place. And you mentioned the possibility of using other indicators like citizenship, well-being, the sense of belonging. But in terms of public speech, when we, and for Cosmic Care, we've did this a few times when we're writing something in the media or when we're speaking to the general community, and you actually speak about this in those terms, people tend to become really, really defensive and say, oh no, but that doesn't interest me, the rights of people that use drugs. And then we have to sort of learn how to, it's like João was saying, this is very far from people's interest. They think, oh, drug use is a choice and I have nothing to do with it, and I think they should be punished. So I think, how can we start because it's easier to sell economic indicators or health indicators and say, oh, it's better if we don't have so many diseases in our community. But how can we motivate people to understand the importance that well-being and citizenship have for all of us, and that when people feel good, it's better for the whole community? What type of arguments can we use to motivate people to look at drug policies on a more egalitarian and social justice way?
Well, so thank you for your question, Elena. And hello, everyone. I was quiet not to interrupt you. I'm sorry I came so late. Well, it's a wonderful question, and it's the more important one. Of course, it's not a very easy idea and way of thinking to sell. But when I speak about other type of indicators, what I'm trying to do is that science is in nowadays in contemporary days is the one of the most credible discourses that you may have. So we have a particular responsibility here. And what I was trying to say is that we are very much focused on the biomedical indicators, public health indicators, forgetting the ones that are connected with the human rights. We don't need to take the option for the human rights indicators, forgetting the others. So what I defend is that we must engage in a complex approach that may accommodate the human rights indicators. And of course, you are dealing with the structural problem, with the ideas, the profound ideas of equality and social justice and so on. But if we don't fight for that, if we don't include that point of view in our work, we will never change things. So drug use is just a symptom many times. So we must address the structural issues. So it's not easy, but I think we must engage in that. And I think many of for example, the Aronid project showed very clearly that the most recent research made in the field of drug use is mostly connected to quantitative approaches and to those types of indicators once again. So we must take in consideration other types of science production to make it richer and to try to change public opinion on these matters. Drug use is just how can I say that? It's just a secondary thing. So if you have a more complete approach, maybe we can change things. And of course, I totally agree with what Joan was saying about the need to create new bridges between science and technical approaches in the field, people who use drugs, but also with decision makers, because that type of dialogue is really crucial and is failing systematically. So I don't know how we can improve things, but I'm certain that we should make an effort on that sense.
Thank you very much, Marta. Like, I don't know if anyone else wants to add on this. Please, João.
Just a very slightly naive comment, but my discussions with decision makers and stakeholders have sometimes the easiest arguments have very high impact, and one of them is reminding them that alcohol is a drug, and in the case of Portugal, is a drug with a lot of harm: domestic violence, road traffic accidents, health related to addiction, etc. And this is very obvious for all of us, but for a politician that drinks wine regularly at lunchtime, there's a way of communicating without shaming, but understanding that regulation probably is better than deregulation. So it's sometimes we are too much immersed in arguments that are much more powerful and science-based, but the person in front of us never thought that having a gin and tonic has a supply chain, a controlled harm, etc. We know the causes of this, the cultural and everything, but just this kind of arguments, more than with tobacco. Alcohol for me is the best comparison. The problem in Portugal, just to not to be also naive on this, the problem in Portugal is that there is no control on alcohol. No control. Well, now it's getting better, but no control on sales, on point of sale, etc. So also in the mind of the politician, he's thinking, well, but my 12-year-old can go and buy a vodka bottle and no one will ask for ID or anything. So that's the problem.
I need to go and drink some alcohol now. It's Friday night.
Well, and I even use it with coffee because it's a stimulant that we are using every day. And people make comments like, I can't start my day until I have my coffee. And it's like, are you using drugs to keep going in your day? And so I think it's something important to just, I mean, even chocolate, what it has in it. And I live with a chocolate addict and he has to have chocolate every day. So it's one of these things where, and there was some questions in there. How do I talk to recreational users about these topics on the YouTube page, or about how to get them to join in the fight? And I think that it's also up to us as activists and organizers to create spaces where people can come together and where they can talk about their use and they can talk about the good experiences that they have. Because one of the things that in the YouTube they were talking about is we should be saying risk reduction, because there isn't always harm, but there are always risks. That we should also be talking in Spanish, we talk about managing pleasure. And so how do we include benefits into drug use? Because the number one reason why people use substances, or why we use substances, is because it brings us pleasure and because we feel good. And there's been some very interesting studies in Canada where they actually list out why people use drugs, which is something that I use a lot with legislators, because I think that they only think of people who use drugs as in the streets and under very harsh conditions, and so I think for that population, obviously the work that Cosmic Care does in providing substance analysis at festivals, Acción Técnica Social, PAS in Mexico, so Energy Control in Spain, so all of those organizations, the Teddy Network, all of these organizations are providing a service, and so it's how do we politicize the folks that we are providing that service to? Because the party is political. It's not just every action we take can be political. And when we did a survey around cocaine, people who use cocaine, for example, in Colombia and in Europe, it was like 84% was willing to pay more for fair trade or some sort of fair trade standard cocaine. And so I think that people do have a conscience, but it's our job as organizers to really help form them in understanding how this has been completely unjust, and that it's not, prohibition is not the fault of the person in the UK who's using cocaine. Prohibition, and it's not the fault of the campesino in Colombia who's cultivating. It has been a choice made by governments to implement a regime that doesn't work, and that they continue to do the same thing expecting different results. And Einstein would have said that it's insane. So it's really about that we've been ignoring the fact that, and it was said in the chat, it's radical to have prohibition, whereas regulation is what we know how to do. And that most people who use substances, we self-regulate, and we do that on a regular basis, and we know how to deal with our use. The hardest part, and that's why decrim, while it is an option, it doesn't go far enough, is that people need a safe supply. And then when you start talking about other substances like heroin, which is now being adulterated with fentanyl, we need to be talking about a safe supply. That's the way the Canadians have framed it. And for us as producing countries, even though we have lots of other activities that happen, it's a development issue. So it's really about connecting that all of this has to do with, if we want to take it to the UN level, achieving the SDGs, and on a local level, ensuring the authorities don't have reasons to abuse their authority and criminalize and harm communities that are involved in these initiatives or this illegal market.
Thank you so much, Zara. We're already way past our time, so we have to wrap up, but I think it couldn't have ended in a better way. You've already said it all, so I'm just gonna let your message and the thing. A lot of other questions were posed about particularly cocaine regulation and other things, but what I advise people that are listening to us is to contact, for example, Zara or Steve directly, or any of the other speakers, or in case you have any doubt, just feel free to reach out to Cosmic Care and we can help you and connect with other people. Thank you all so much. You were so kind to give us part of your Friday evening to be here with us. It was an amazing pleasure to moderate this debate. Thank you so much to all of you, and have a wonderful weekend. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Good,
Bye-bye.
Great job.